A 23-month-old girl was beaten and forced to bounce on a toy ball until her tiny body gave out, before being stuffed into a dresser and left forgotten. And the ones responsible, her own mother and the man she chose over her child? Well, now both will spend decades behind bars for the torture and death of little Oaklee Snow. We are going to break down this horrifyingly tragic case right now. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. An Indiana mother and her boyfriend will now spend decades in prison for the absolutely horrific abuse and death of her one-year-old daughter, whose tiny body was discovered stuffed inside of a dresser in an abandoned home. 24-year-old Madison Marshall and her boyfriend, 28-year-old Roan Waters, were sentenced on June 13th to decades behind bars after pleading guilty to neglect charges involving this little girl, Oaklee Snow, who just endured unimaginable cruelty at the hands of those who should have been protecting her. According to the probable cause affidavit, Oaklee suffered routine beatings for normal toddler behavior, like holding a fork wrong. She was choked, and in her final moments, she apparently was forced to bounce violently on a toy ball. But the horror began long before that fateful day. This nightmare began in the small town of Cromwell, Oklahoma, in October of 2022. According to the probable cause affidavit that was obtained by Law&Crime on October 26, Madison Marshall had made a frantic call to the local county sheriff's deputies after her boyfriend, Roan Waters, struck their one-year-old daughter, Oaklee, so hard it split the inside of her mouth. But apparently when help arrived, Waters was the one who met deputies with hostility. The affidavit chillingly details, quote, "R. Waters answered the front door and asked the deputies if they had a warrant to be on his property. Before they could answer, he slammed the door in their faces. The deputies attempted to explain through the closed door the purpose of their presence there was for a welfare check, but R. Waters yelled for them to get the bleep out." Now, outside the home, deputies end up finding Marshall waiting in a blue SUV with Oaklee and her infant brother. But their attempt to investigate was thwarted when Waters spotted Marshall speaking to officers. According to the affidavit, quote, "He immediately began yelling so that the deputies could no longer hear what the occupants of the SUV were saying. R. Waters also began playing loud music to further inhibit their conversation." So with communication basically impossible, deputies ended up leaving after Marshall told them that she and her children weren't in danger. Marshall later filed a formal complaint, and she described Waters slapping her so hard it left visible bruises when she tried to intervene on Oaklee's behalf. But she only asked for police to press charges against Waters for what happened to Oaklee, not her. So on November 7, 2022, a warrant was issued for Waters' arrest on charges of child abuse and domestic assault in the presence of a minor. But before authorities could act, Waters, Marshall disappeared, taking Oaklee with them. Now, before I get any further into this, and obviously you know where this is going, I want to bring on Indiana criminal defense attorney Max Wiley. Max, thanks so much for coming here on Sidebar. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jesse.
You have both defendants here who accepted plea deals. And from a defense standpoint, what would be the strategic reasons someone might plead guilty in such a high-profile child death case like this? Is it that the facts and the evidence are so bad? And I know we're going to get into a lot of it, but was it surprising to you that you see guilty pleas here?
No, it looks like a case where the evidence is just overwhelming against these two individuals. I think both of them were probably just doing damage control, essentially, and making sure that they didn't get even worse sentences. Certainly, Rowan, the male involved, was looking at a murder charge and a possibility of up to 65 years. With Madison, she was probably looking more in the 30s, but I think with both of them, they just weren't going to win at trial with these facts.
You got to explain. You got to explain certain details of this to me. So you have the deputies. They were essentially blocked from entering the home. They left after Marshall said the children were fine. Is this a common situation where, I don't know, just based on the reading of it, you would think, you know, is she actually fine? Are the kids actually fine? Or is there not more that they can do at that point? They had to leave.
So that certainly surprised me reading about it in the probable cause affidavit. I don't believe the police officers should have left in that situation. They should have definitely checked and made sure everyone was all right. So yeah, I'm surprised they did leave. I think that would have raised some major red flags.
By the way, as you know, we're always writing sidebars, we're researching, we're doing breaking news, and I am constantly on the run and I get hungry, so it's not so easy just to grab something. That is why I'm so happy that we have Huel as our sponsor. It's spelled Huel, and their Black Edition, ready to drink. This is a total game changer. Why? This is a complete meal in one bottle. It has 35 grams of protein, 27 vitamins and minerals, high fiber, low sugar, so you feel full, focused, and ready for your day. There's no prep, there's no cleanup, just grab and go. Huel's already sold over 500 million meals around the world. Also, by the way, affordable. You get everything you need in less than $5. And I love how many different flavors they have. Iced coffee, strawberry banana, chocolate. So when I'm rushing to get Sidebar done, particularly in breaking news, I can just always grab one of these bottles. Start saving time and money without compromising your nutrition today with this exclusive offer for new customers of 15% off plus a free gift using our exclusive code SIDEBAR at Huel.com. Check out our description for the terms and conditions and skip the stress, not the nutrition. The fact that she initially reported abuse but only asked for charges to be pursued related to what happened to Oaklee, not herself, does that impact how authorities maybe handled the case early on or what they perceived?
It likely did. I mean, that indicates she's not going to be cooperative. And I think that's probably her thought, is she didn't want to be a witness against Roan. And so that might have made the prosecutors in Oklahoma think that this was going to be a tough case to prove if they didn't have a cooperative mom involved. To me, that should have been another red flag. They should have realized that, that Roan's a bad guy and that he's got this woman that's in fear of him. Certainly the way he acted towards the police is very troubling. And so, to me, they should have been looking harder at him at that point in Oklahoma.
Yeah, because her role's complex, right? She reports the abuse, she flees, she was apparently present when Oaklee died. You could wonder if fear or coercion affected her decisions and ultimately her reporting. But let me talk about what happened here. So I said they disappeared. You fast forward now to January 19th, 2023. And this is when Oaklee's biological father, Zachary Snow, awoke to what is essentially every parent's worst nightmare. His two children, 23-month-old Oaklee and his 6-month-old child, had vanished. He reported them missing to the Seminole County Sheriff's Office and told them that he believed they were fleeing to stay with Waters' family. So the search came to a head on March 3rd, 2023, when Waters was arrested at a hotel in Greenwood Village, Colorado. Marshall was present, but she wasn't detained. And most importantly, the two children, they were nowhere to be seen. So Waters apparently spun this fabricated story claiming that they had abandoned both of the children at an Indianapolis trap house before fleeing to Colorado. But the horrifying truth was far worse. Oaklee was already dead, and Waters knew exactly where her tiny body lay hidden. For 2 agonizing weeks after Waters' arrest, the search for Oaklee intensified. The FBI joined the investigation on March 6, 2023, scouring every lead. And then on March 16th, police issued an arrest warrant for Marshall on charges of neglect of a dependent. And when officers finally apprehended Marshall on March 23rd, she delivered a confession so chilling it would expose the full horror of Oaklee's final hours. According to the affidavit, Marshall stated, quote, R. Waters had killed Oaklee at approximately 1:30 p.m. on February 9th, 2023. Marshall had been in the kitchen of 305 Albany Street, Indianapolis, Indiana, when R. Waters entered holding Oaklee. Oaklee was no longer wearing clothes and was not responsive. R. Waters initially tried to put her in the bathtub to immerse her in cold water in the hopes of reviving her. When that failed, R. Waters wrapped Oaklee in a pink and black colored blanket that had hearts on it and put her in a rear passenger seat of the Dodge Durango. Now, Marshall said that she couldn't call 911 because Waters had apparently slapped her so hard the phone fell out of her hands. But this isn't all she said happened on that day. You know, Max, Marshall was present during Oaklee's final moments, not immediately arrested when Waters was. Is that typical? Is that strange?
It's a little bit out of the ordinary, I would say. I think with this, you knew Waters was kind of the more culpable of the two. And so I think probably at that point, they're giving Marshall the benefit of the doubt and hoping that she's a mom who's just maybe the victim of abuse herself. But then it would come to light that she had a lot more culpability and that she certainly had a role that she played in this poor child's death.
What is the role? What is the culpability? Because if you take the allegations as true, right? So you take it that Waters had slapped the phone out of her hand, so she couldn't call 911. But if she witnessed the aftermath of this child's death, was still kind of on the run with Waters, what is her culpability from a legal point of view?
Well, there's several different avenues kind of in which she was culpable. For one, there's accomplice liability. And so she at some point becomes an accomplice in this, and she's assisting Rowan in running from the law and covering up the death of Oaklee. So that's one. Certainly, it appears that she could have gotten medical attention for Oaklee at some point, potentially saved Oaklee's life. We don't really know the exact details of how Oaklee died because her body was so badly decomposed. But I think that's another way in which she could have been legally liable, is that she could have potentially gotten medical attention that could have saved Oaklee's life. So that's a potential avenue. And then she also knew Rowan, was beating Oaklee and was abusive, and so she's leaving her child with Rowan and in Rowan's care, and so that's another way in which she's liable because it's her child. She's got to ensure her child's safety.
Yeah, there's a 2-week gap, right, between Waters' arrest and Marshall's. Oaklee remained missing, and you wonder from a legal point of view, could that delay be used, against a person, obviously, but the legal obligations of a parent to report the death of their child, especially when they're not the direct killer, but know what happened, that's a significant legal obligation, right?
It is actually. I don't know that alone would be criminal liability. I don't know that you have an obligation to inform the police that somebody's murdered her child, as crazy as that sounds, because most people would certainly want to tell the police in that scenario. I think it's more that she aided in the cover up, and that she kind of assisted Rowan and was there when he left the body in the abandoned house in the dresser. And then, and so then at some point, her not reporting it certainly becomes her assisting him. But I don't think she had a duty necessarily to report her child. We just assumed people would do that.
So you go back to that day, and what else Marshall apparently told police? Well, she said that in the morning, this is February 9th of 2023, the two of them awoke to Oaklee crying because she was hungry, but they didn't feed her. Instead, she told police R. Waters threw Oaklee onto the floor in response to this due to her crying had agitated him. Her head's impact with the floor had caused Oaklee to have a red bump above her right eye. Marshall applied some of her own makeup to Oaklee's face to try to hide the bruise. And then Marshall had apparently said that Waters was later heard yelling at Oaklee and literally forcing her to bounce up and down on a bouncy ball. The affidavit reads he was specifically ordering her to bounce on her bouncy ball. She recalled hearing R. Waters' voice continually getting louder and angrier as he told her to bounce. After the fifth and loudest time that he yelled at her, Marshall stopped what she was doing in the kitchen and walked into the living room. She observed R. Waters standing over Oaklee as she sat trying to bounce on the ball. If that wasn't torture enough, it only gets worse because it ends in just absolute tragedy. After hearing Waters scream in unrecognizable tone, Marshall rushed in to find him clutching Oaklee's limp body. The affidavit details, quote, she saw that Oaklee was not moving. R. Waters continually repeated without prompting that he didn't do anything and that it wasn't his fault. He initially refused to let Marshall take Oaklee from him and stripped her of her clothes. Marshall could see Oaklee's stomach and chest cavity extend as if she was trying to breathe air. However, she observed what appeared to be a mix of blood and spittle dripping from her mouth when she tried to exhale, which created a gurgling sound. And this is when she said the two of them tried to revive her but failed. Oh, and by the way, Marshall also told police that this incident was far from isolated. She admitted that Waters routinely whooped Oaklee for normal toddler behaviors, holding a fork wrong, wetting her diaper, eating too slowly, and the abuse escalated to Waters choking Oaklee unconscious multiple times, violence so severe the toddler stopped eating around him out of pure terror. But this time was different. By this point, Oaklee was unresponsive. This is absolutely horrifying, Max. I mean, it's difficult for me even to talk about it. When you have Marshall admitting that the abuse was ongoing, even describing instances where Waters choked her, that Oaklee was unconscious, how does that repeated failure to protect a child factor into a neglect case? And also, I do wonder if this did go to trial, how much could you prove? Is it all based on witness testimony? Is it all based on Marshall cooperating? How much could if this is repeated over a given amount of time, a medical examiner, how much could they actually determine?
Well, that's a very good point, Jesse. And the abuse just is horrific that we hear about. It's some of the worst abuse I've ever seen. A lot of it is coming from Miss Marshall herself. And, there's probably not witnesses to a lot of this abuse. And so a lot of it would be proven through her testimony. And she ultimately agreed to cooperate and was going to testify against Roan. Hopefully there were some other witnesses that could corroborate her story. It sounds to me like just some of the details she was able to provide about the abuse were credible. And it sounds like Roan Waters was a very violent and abusive person. And so I think a lot of it would have been proven through Marshall's testimony, but it seems like she was credible in that regard.
What are the defenses to something like this?
I mean, this is a case that's probably indefensible ultimately. With Marshall, perhaps you can point to the abuse that she suffered at the hands of Waters. And you could argue that most of what she did was because she was afraid of Waters. And certainly drugs played, I think, a significant role. It sounds like I think they're both heavily addicted to fentanyl. With Waters, it just sounds like there's no defense. He would have had to go after Marshall's credibility. That would have to be it. He'd have to attack Marshall.
And as I mentioned earlier, instead of calling 911 or rushing her to the hospital, Waters wrapped this little girl's lifeless body in a blanket, drove her toward rural Morgan County. This is an area that he knew well from his childhood. And at an abandoned house, Marshall said Waters carried Oaklee's body up a steep hill through thick brambles and bush before stuffing her into a dresser. And when it was done, Waters turned to Marshall and coldly said, "I don't need to kill you now." April 21st, 2023, a sobbing, hysterical Marshall led investigators to that abandoned house, and the stench of decomposition hit them before they even saw the dresser. Inside the bottom drawer, they found Oaklee's tiny body, her blonde hair still in a ponytail, her left leg grotesquely bent at the knee with her foot resting on her chest. A single blue and white sock clung to her small foot. And per reporting from the Indy Star, the coroner ruled her death a homicide, though the full extent of her injuries made the exact cause unclear. Max, is that surprising that we don't know the exact cause? And again, from a legal point of view, if this went to trial, is that something that the defense could have used to their benefit, or is it pretty clear cut what happened here?
Well, so it's not surprising because of the length that this child was in that dresser. I mean, it was a solid 2 months, essentially 2 months plus that the body had been left there in the dresser. And so there's probably a tremendous amount of decomposition where you probably couldn't see much of, the body. It's probably skeletal remains. And so that, from a defense standpoint, that probably did play a role in the state being willing to dismiss the murder charge, because ultimately it's hard to prove medically how Oaklee died because there's probably so little left of the body, as terrible as that sounds. And so I think that probably did play a role with them ultimately pleading Roan to the neglect causing death as a level 1 felony instead of murder, which from his defense attorney standpoint was probably somewhat of a success because murder can carry up to 65 years. It's kind of a double-edged sword because those pictures just had to be just absolutely horrific. And so a jury that sees those pictures is going to want to convict. Those pictures would have been just the worst things you've ever seen.
And the fact that Marshall led them to the body, I mean, you're guilty of sin at that point.
Certainly. I mean, that corroborates Marshall's testimony. Ultimately, she cooperated and provided some important information, and so I think she probably would have been a pretty good witness at the end of the day. And I'm guessing her cooperating and taking the deal to testify against Waters was probably the nail in the coffin in terms of him taking a plea and agreeing to go to prison for 45 years.
Yeah, so in April of 2025, Marshall pleaded guilty to 1 count of neglect of a dependent resulting in death and 1 count of neglect by placing a dependent in a dangerous situation. She received concurrent sentences of 25 years and 2 years respectively. And as part of her plea deal, she agreed to testify against Waters, though, again, she never had to. Waters himself pleaded guilty to 3 counts of neglect of a dependent, was sentenced to 45 years in prison. And following the sentencing, Chief Trial Deputy for the Marion County Prosecutor's Office, Dan Cicchini, stated, "The fact that 2 adults who had the care of this child would let these things happen to her and do these things to her is just terrifying. And that's why they're going to the Department of Corrections. That's why that 45-year number is important. It's because it is as serious a crime as it gets. They were entrusted with the care of a 2-year-old baby and failed miserably, and it resulted in her death. Is there any way, Max, that they can get out sooner?
Likely not. In Indiana, you serve 75% of your time, so that 45 becomes 32 or so. But anything beyond that, the prosecutor would have to agree to it, and I don't think this prosecutor's office will ever agree for these folks to do any less time than they agreed to in the plea agreements.
What would be the advantage of not offering a plea, going to trial on a murder or a manslaughter charge, and just say, we're taking this all the way, this is a serious crime, we have the evidence? Why even offer a plea on these lesser charges? Why even do that?
Well, so I think probably it came down to murder being fairly hard to prove in a situation like this. And that goes back to the fact that the body was heavily decomposed. I think that probably played a pretty significant role. Beyond that, in terms of how Oaklee actually died, most of what you have is Miss Marshall's testimony. And so you've got the testimony of a cooperating co-defendant, and that can always be challenging because she's taking a deal, she's getting a benefit to testify against Waters. And so I'm guessing that all played a role, and ultimately the prosecutor was satisfied with the 45 years, which is a long sentence. So he'll be in prison for a long, long time.
Such a tragic case, such a sad case on so many different levels. Max Wiley, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate you coming here on Sidebar.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Jesse.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.